Okay. Thank you, Andrew and Ray Lynn, for those papers. Thank you, John, for your introduction, and thank you very much to the Society for having me. I am delighted and honored to be here. In 1851, a concern of Scottish publishers and booksellers purchased the copyrights to the works of Sir Walter Scott from Robert Cadell. Led by Edinburgh publishers Adam and Charles Black, the investors paid £27,000 to take over the copyright. Scott was an extremely popular author, but this investment presented its proprietors with several challenges. I'm going to talk today about the nature of those challenges and some of the tactics that the publishers employed to navigate them. I will focus on two related groups of illustrated editions of Scott's narrative poems. First, a group of Christmas gift editions of the major narrative poems, and second, a group of souvenir editions of The Lady of the Lake. I will show how each of these editions was designed to solve a particular problem. I hope this talk will achieve a couple of things. It will offer a case study to consider how Victorian publishers used illustration as a marketing strategy, and it will add to the publication history of the works of Walter Scott, one of the most popular and most reprinted authors of the 19th century. William Todd and Anne Bowden, of course, have covered the publication history of Scott's works up to 1832 in their bibliographical history. The Victorian publications of the novels have been discussed by Ruth McAdams, but the Victorian publishing history of the poems remains largely unaddressed. In my talk today, I will try to begin to fill in this lacuna. Much of my evidence comes from the Adam and Charles Black archives in the National Library of Scotland, specifically the minutes book of the meetings of investors in the Scott concern. I have also, of course, taken 1 or 2 or 50 looks at the books themselves. I should say before I start that the editions that I will discuss represent an important but small fraction of the publications of the concern. I'm focusing on high-end editions of Scott's poetry, but the Blacks were also publishing at the same time cheaper editions of the poems and several editions of Scott's novels. This is a part of the story. So, why was the purchase of the Scott copyright a risky investment? First of all, it was expensive. £27,000 was a lot of money, and the investors had taken out a loan for the purchase, which would have to be repaid. In addition, the property faced competition from Cadell's recent editions of the works. The minutes mention the variety of modes in which the works have been brought out by Mr. Cadell during the last few years, and the great sales which have been the result of these operations. The unsold copies of Cadell's editions were included with the purchase of the copyright, so the Blacks would need to sell off all of this remaining stock. In doing so, they risked eclipsing their own new publications. The minutes also mention a more significant problem, the comparatively short period to elapse ere the copyrights begin to expire. Under the Copyright Act of 1842, copyright protection lasted either the remainder of the author's life plus 7 years, or 42 years from the work's publication date, whichever term was longer. For Scott's works, protection would last 42 years from the date of publication. Unfortunately, there was some ambiguity about what those dates were. In the early 1830s, Cadell had published new editions of both the novels and the poetry, with significant revisions and notes by the author. The copyright protection on the revised texts lasted longer than the protection on the original texts. So the revised poetical works of Walter Scott had been published in 1833 and 34, and the revised poems would remain in copyright until 1875 and 76. But the original texts of the works would come out of copyright much sooner. The protection on the original version of The Lady of the Lake would end in 1852, only 1 year after the Blacks bought the copyright. The original text of Waverley would be out of copyright in 1856, and the original text of Marmion was already out of copyright. The Blacks held the copyrights to the revised editions, which were presumably to be preferred, but other publishers could and did begin to print some of the original texts. In 1851, even as the Blacks were buying the copyright, the Illustrated London News was publishing a 2-volume collection of Scott's poetry. When the Blacks consulted their lawyers about this, they were told that they did not have sufficient legal grounds to pursue an action against the News. They managed to come to an amicable agreement about this publication, but it was clear that their investment was not fully protected. They needed to stake their claim to the Scott property publicly, and they had to turn a profit on their investment quickly before the copyrights on the original texts ran out. They began by circulating an advertisement in newspapers and magazines, announcing their possession of the copyright, cautioning other printers against violating it, and warning the public that no work published under the title of the poetical works of Sir Walter Scott is complete unless it be published by Robert Cadell or Adam and Charles Black. But that advertisement would accomplish relatively little on its own. They needed a strategy. In early meetings of the concern, investor Henry Wright argued that the property could not continue remunerative unless some impetus be given to it. The proprietors needed to devise a scheme for the purpose of promoting the sale of the works, which would not only be novel in character, but also successful in operation. The impetus, the scheme that they settled on, was to publish elaborate, expensive Christmas gift editions of Scott's major poems. This is the first group of editions that I'll focus on today. Following Wright's suggestions, the investors decided to aim for quality rather than quantity. They wished to publish a few prestigious editions to capture public attention, while Cadell's old stock was sold off at lowered prices. These new editions, they resolved, should be got up in the first style so as to command an extensive sale. As a new edition of the novels would take years to prepare and publish, they worked on the poetry. They began with The Lady of the Lake at Christmas 1852. Again, the original text of the poem had come out of copyright by this time, so they needed this gift edition to be obviously superior to any competitors. They made as much as they could of the fact that this was the author's final version of the text, but they focused on making this volume beautiful. They wanted something well done in regard to paper and print, but more especially, illustration. They planned an edition that would be elegant but stylistically conservative, modeled after some of the great gift books of the 1840s. The minutes specifically mention Bogue's 1847 edition of Longfellow's Evangeline, which included illustrations by Burkitt Foster, John Gilbert, and Jane Benham, and the Etching Club's 1841 edition of Goldsmith's poems. After J.M.W. Turner refused a request to illustrate the volume, the investors commissioned Burkitt Foster and John Gilbert to produce 60 wood engravings for the book, at the cost of £360, which was about 27% of the entire cost of the edition. The two illustrators divided the work between them. Gilbert was responsible for character scenes like this one, while Foster produced landscape views like these, visiting many sites in person to make accurate sketches. The book did come out in time for Christmas, 1852, and it was priced at 18 shillings. Commercially, this edition of The Lady of the Lake was a success. 90% of the copies sold within 6 months, earning the investors a small profit of about £60. But remember, the principal goal here was not really to turn a large profit. It was to spark interest in all of the Black's other Scott publications. They were, at this exact time, also planning and beginning to publish editions of the novels and cheaper editions of the poetry. The Christmas books were meant to support these parallel publications by dominating the market, attracting public attention, and demonstrating the desirability of the Black's publications. They also had to maintain demand for new editions of these aging texts. In 1852, The Lady of the Lake was 42 years old, older than many of the proprietors. With these Christmas editions, the Blacks hoped to draw the public eye. They were delighted, therefore, when The Lady of the Lake was a major critical success. The reviews for the book were glorious. The Inverness Courier asserted that, as a Christmas present, this volume is unsurpassed. The Lady's newspaper described the book as completely and harmoniously splendid. The Edinburgh News said, "Certainly a piece of more perfect typography or better printed woodcuts could nowhere be seen, not even in London. The entire book, in short, is a credit to our town and nation." Foster's landscape illustrations came in for particular praise. Reviews lauded the exceeding fidelity of his depictions, noting that he had made his sketches on the spot. Reviews also noted how appropriate it was for this poem in particular to be illustrated with landscape views, arguing that a large part of its appeal was due to Scott's descriptions of Scottish scenery. One review commented on the host of tourists that the poem had precipitated on its original publication, and remarked that for contemporary travelers looking for a record of their Scottish tours, there could be no better or more appropriate memorial than the very handsome volume before us. The woodcuts, profusely scattered through its pages, picture almost every place of interest in the poem, from Strathgartney to Loch Lomond. Reviews like this were worth everything the Blacks had invested in the edition and more. They printed a second edition in June 1853 and began to plan the next of their Christmas books, The Lay of the Last Minstrel, for Christmas 1853. They spent £600 on the wood engravings for the lay, considerably more than the £360 that they had spent to illustrate the lady. The lay was followed by Marmion at Christmas 1854 and by the Lord of the Isles at Christmas 1856, all issued in the same style, all with illustrations by Foster and Gilbert. Unfortunately, after The Lady of the Lake, the other Christmas editions fell a little flat. The critical response was approving, but not ebullient. Though these beautiful editions had seemed at first to be harbingers of success, they soon became a hassle. The Lady of the Lake was the only one that sold well enough to merit a second edition. In 1858, the investors noted that the sale of the Christmas books had been steadily diminishing for some time. The firm had not turned a profit on any of them except for the first edition of Lady. In fact, they had not broken even. Unnerved, the proprietors resolved that the stock of the Christmas books should be pushed off as vigorously as could be. In 1858, a large number of unsold copies were sold at a discount to Lippincott and Company of Philadelphia. In 1862, the blacks sold the last copies of Marmion and the Lord of the Isles to William Allen of London, and only by remaindering these editions did they finally break even. Overall, the late 1850s were a worrying time for the Scott concern. The Crimean War was making the book market unpredictable. The concern was encumbered by bad debts and by the accumulating interest on the bank loan that the proprietors had taken out to buy the copyrights in the first place. In 1855, at their yearly meeting, the proprietors urged economy in management, cessation from any speculation, and industry in pushing sales. In the next yearly meeting in 1856, they admitted that they were a little desperate. The bank loan had not decreased, and the publishers described the interest as a heavy incubus on the property. It was time for a change in strategy. At this point, the blacks had successfully established their reputation as the new publishers of Walter Scott. The minutes no longer mention any attempts to defend their copyright. Instead, the problems the black faced now was how to make enough money from the Scott property to pay off the bank loan. Slowly and gradually, they transitioned away from a strategy of speculation towards one of canny exploitation of existing resources. They continued to print various editions of the novels and both cheap and elegant editions of the poetry, but they no longer commissioned new illustrations, focusing instead on using the materials that they already had. In 1856, they published a new gift edition of the poetry, a super royal octavo issued on handsome tinted paper, but printed from wood engravings and stereotype plates that they already had in stock. In 1863, they published a new gift edition of The Lady of the Lake, reusing again all the wood engravings from the Christmas edition, now a decade old. While the Christmas editions had been priced at 18 shillings, this edition sold for 5. In its first year, only about 42% of the copies printed actually sold, about 1,675 out of 4,000. The blacks looked for a new strategy to push it off the shelves. They produced an issue aimed carefully at a specific segment of the reading population, tourists. They reissued unsold copies of the 1863 Lady of the Lake with inserted photographs by George Washington Wilson of Aberdeen. Wilson was popular with tourists. One of the most successful and prolific photographers in Victorian Scotland, he was best known for his landscape views. By illustrating their book with Wilson's photographs, as well as Foster and Gilbert's wood engravings, the blacks transformed this issue into a tourist souvenir, and a fashionable one at that. Here, the blacks were using an unusual strategy. Instead of making their unsold copies cheaper, they made them more expensive. Copies of the 1863 edition without photographs had sold for 5 shillings. Photographically illustrated copies of Lady sold for 8 shillings and 6pence, considerably more. Instead of tranching down, as William Sinclair calls it, they tranched up. This plan worked because it took shrewd advantage of existing resources and circumstances. First, it used pre-existing supplies, printed sheets from the 1863 edition, which themselves had been printed from the wood-engraved blocks commissioned in 1852. Wilson and Company printed the photographs, so the blacks could issue these souvenir books with minimal investment of capital. Second, the souvenir issue responded to Scott's popularity among tourists. The 1810 publication of The Lady of the Lake had turned the setting of the poem, the Trossachs, into an enormously popular tourist destination, and tourism in Scotland had only increased since then. Reviewers of the Christmas edition had already identified the book as a potential souvenir, thanks to Foster's landscape illustrations. By inserting photographs of Scottish scenery, the Blacks could easily market The Lady of the Lake to a growing tourist audience. Third, by marketing Lady as a souvenir in this way, the Blacks took advantage of their existing grasp on the tourist book market. In 1863, they had already been publishing popular and successful guidebooks to Scotland for over 2 decades, and in their guides, they could advertise this new photographic souvenir for free. This strategy was a quiet success. The minutes of the Scott Concern don't cover these photographic issues in detail, but they do state that the volumes were well received by the trade and the public. The books did not attract much attention from the press, but they sold throughout the decade. 581 copies in 1865, 848 in 1866, 688 in 1867. These numbers were smaller than the sales of the Christmas editions, but they were steady, and so the Blacks continued to issue and reissue The Lady of the Lake with photographic illustrations into the 1870s. These souvenir issues also started a minor publishing trend. In the late 60s and early 70s, other Scottish publishers began to produce similar volumes. In 1869, Thomas Nelson and Sons put out their own photographic souvenir edition of The Lady of the Lake. In 1871, John Ross and Company put out a photographic souvenir edition of Marmion. Of course, these publishers were infringing on the Blacks' territory, but this demonstrates how the Blacks had managed to shape the market for Scott. Other publishers who were possibly stealing their material were also stealing their style. From the story of these books, the Christmas editions and the souvenir editions, I draw 2 conclusions. First, this history helps to illuminate the publishing and the reception history of Walter Scott. Not only does it demonstrate that at this time The Lady of the Lake was easily the most popular of Scott's poems, it also reveals how closely the reception of Scott's poetry was connected to Scottish tourism. The reviews for the gift editions focused on the depictions of landscape in the book and their appeal for tourists. The souvenir editions obviously were aimed carefully and specifically at the tourist market. When The Lady of the Lake was first published, it had attracted waves of tourists to the Trossachs. Scott had sold Scotland as a travel destination. 40 and 50 years later, the poem was still popular because of its tourist interest. One could say that at this point, Scotland was selling Scott. Second, and finally, these editions offer a case study to demonstrate the importance of illustration in mid-Victorian publishing and marketing strategy. The Blacks consistently turned to illustration as a reliable method of renovating older texts for a modern audience. When faced with a challenging market, they published illustrated editions, the most fashionable that they could afford. In the early 1850s, that meant the highest quality wood engraving. In the 60s, that meant the latest illustration technology, photography. But regardless of the process, illustrations were their favorite device for signaling quality and attracting attention.